are these carvings on a wall at the Dendera temple complex in Egypt. To some, the strange designs look eerily similar to objects very much in use today.
In Egypt, there is this underground crypt at Dendera that was always secret, and only the high priests had access to that crypt. And it's very hot in there, very narrow, low ceiling, and on the walls you have these reliefs of what looks like ancient light bulbs. Because we have to question one thing: how did the ancient Egyptians light the inside of their tombs?
The Egyptian light bulb theory. Let's see what we can figure out about it. Let's start by listening to some of the reasons that ancient astronaut theorists believe it's true.
According to most mainstream archaeologists, torches were used by the ancient Egyptians to light the pitch-black chambers of tombs and temples. Yet nowhere on the ceilings is there even the slightest evidence of soot or smoke residue.
It's hard to know why they're saying this, because there is black soot in almost every Egyptian temple and tomb. In fact, a recent ceiling cleaning conducted at the Temple of Hathor, which is the same temple where the so-called light bulb relief is found, they uncovered a brightly colored ancient ceiling painting that had never before been noticed. What was covering it up, you ask? I will quote them directly. They said that the ceiling was covered with, quote, hundreds of years of black soot. That's kind of funny, you have to admit.
Also, there isn't enough oxygen inside those tombs with which to support or feed a flame of a torch. I was once inside the king's chamber, inside the Pyramid of Giza, and somebody turned off the lights, and immediately we were in pitch darkness. And I said, no problem, I'll just take out my lighter from my satchel, and I turn on the lighter, and it didn't work.
I don't know about his specific Zippo, but there are plenty of documented explorations of the pyramid and other tombs in the early part of the 20th century which used torches to light the pyramids. Archaeologist and pyramid expert John Romer was once asked a similar question by someone on a television show. This was his response, quote, "As for the soot, there is soot in the Great Pyramid from the 19th century travelers, but most of it has been washed off. Most of the pyramids, of course, were built in sunlight, so lighting the interior would only have been a problem after the roof went on. They would have used lamps with salt in the oil so the flame burns very pure," end quote. Romer isn't just guessing about the olive oil lamps. These lamps were depicted in Egyptian reliefs, and there are even receipts for orders of their wicks and other such evidence. Another thing to consider is that, as far as tombs go, they weren't expected to be lit. In fact, if all went well, robbers would not be able to find a way in, and the tomb would never see the light of day ever again. That was the plan. And if it weren't for 19th century explorers and dynamite, that plan might have worked too. But when we're talking about temples, like at Dendera, the false dilemma of not enough oxygen simply doesn't work. The temple is much more open. The oxygen levels are plentiful. They obviously used fire to light it, if for no other reason than because of the hundreds of years of black soot on the ceiling. Okay, so the false dilemmas have been addressed, but we're still left to explain what this relief is depicting. Let's first hear what Ancient Aliens has to say about the mainstream interpretations of this relief.
Egyptologists' explanation of this, and they have to have some explanation, there's got to be one. It has to be pretty mundane. It can't be that it's an electrical device. Their explanation is that it is a lotus flower, and what appears to be a bulb around is the aroma of the lotus flower. And so it's just a very odd depiction of a flower.
That is a terrible representation of the mainstream view of this relief. It's ancient aliens using a straw man argument to make their argument look superior. This relief is not so mystical if you have a little understanding of Egyptian art and religious symbols. This is a variant depiction of the creation of the world in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptians believed that before anything else existed, there was a vast primordial sea of nothingness. They believed that the first thing to emerge from this sea was a lotus flower. This is probably because the lotus closes at night and sinks underwater. In the morning, it reemerges and blooms again. It was believed that the lotus flower then gave birth to the first god, who was often associated with the sun. This relief was done after the god Atum was merged with the sun god Ra, and thus became Atum Re. Atum, the god who created everything else after this point, is actually represented by a snake. And yes, it is a snake in these reliefs, not light bulb filaments. You can actually see the eyes and other elements of a snake if you look closely. This is pretty standard Egyptian mythology, that the lotus flower came forth first, and then the first god Atum, who was represented by a snake. Well, what about this bubble surrounding it? I will quote an expert directly on this point. Quote, "Despite the variety of deities, the Egyptians conceived the origin of the world as singular. Only one god, Atum, was responsible for the emergence of the universe as a bubble of air in the vast, limitless, inert ocean and everlasting darkness of the undifferentiated primordial waters, none, that existed before creation. In other words, the universe came forth from the lotus in a bubble of air." The other elements of this picture back this interpretation up. The universal bubble is here being supported or raised up by the goddess Nun. Nun is the primordial waters, and technically it is she that raises up the lotus, Atum, and everything else. This pose of outstretched hands is one of the more common motifs for Nun, and she raises and supports the universe from nothingness. In some versions of the story, the sun god represented in these scenes is Khepri, who is represented as a scarab beetle. Atum and Khepri sort of traded off being aspects of Ra in Egyptian mythology. So in essence, in more common versions of this scene, you have Nun, the primordial waters, lifting up the solar barge of Ra for its first journey across the sky. And this explains why the exact same poses are seen in this creation scene at Dendera. They are also depicting Nun raising up the universe out of her waters. This idea is very, very common. You can see other images of Ra emerging from the primordial lotus as well. The idea that the ancient Egyptians used electricity is something that is not even hinted at anywhere in the Egyptian records. And if you believe ancient aliens, they were not just using electricity, but vacuum tubes, which requires high amounts of electricity as well as rarefied gases like argon. And if this was the case, we should expect to find some mention of this somewhere. Ah, but Ancient Aliens has an answer for why we do not.
But if the ancient Egyptians had used some kind of electric light to illuminate their passageways, why does the visual evidence exist only in the temple at Dendera?
In Egypt, you had different areas of specialty, and Dendera was the area where the knowledge of the light-giving source was kept. And this secret knowledge was kept by the high priests. And they're the only ones who were privy to this type of information, because Dendera was the special place where this specific knowledge was guarded and kept.
Right. Of course, there's nothing in any text or on any wall that would back up anything that he just said. He even makes up this phrase, keepers of the light-giving source or whatever, just to make it sound official. Again, it's interesting that the temple where the knowledge of this light was kept is the same one with the hundreds of years of soot on the ceiling. Maybe they were trying to save on their electric bill. In conclusion, all the reasons that Ancient Aliens says light bulbs existed in ancient Egypt, such as no soot in the tombs and not enough oxygen, are easily dismissed as false dilemmas, and the so-called light bulb pictures are easily explained using standard Egyptian symbolism.